Sanjay College of Criminal Justice, and I'm completing my pre-doctoral internship at Mount Sinai Morningside Hospital in New York City. Just to provide a brief overview for today's panel, we will first hear opening remarks from each of our panelists. Then I'll pose a question related to mental health and treatment to the panel. And finally, we'll open up the discussion to the audience for questions and dialogue towards the end of the session. So I'm honored to introduce our panelists today. First, we'll hear from Dr. Adeyinka Akinsulure-Smith. Dr. Adeyinka Akinsulure-Smith is a licensed psychologist who is originally from Sierra Leone. She is board certified in group psychology by the American Board of Professional Psychology. She is a tenured professor of psychology at the City College of New York, the City University of New York, and at the Graduate Center CUNY. Dr. Akinsulure-Smith has cared for forced migrants as well as survivors of torture, armed conflict, and human rights abuses from around the world at the Bellevue Program for Survivors of Torture since 1999. A proud co-founder of Na Wa Yone, Incorporated, a nonprofit organization created to proactively respond to war survivors from the African diaspora, Dr. Akinsulure-Smith and her co-founders at Na Wa Yone were among the 2003 recipients of New York City's prestigious Union Square Awards. In 2005, she received Teachers College Columbia University's Early Career Award. From 2008 to 2010, Dr. Akinsulure-Smith served on the APA's task force on the psychological effect of war on children and families who are refugees from armed conflicts residing in the United States. Dr. Akinsulure-Smith has participated in human rights investigations in Sierra Leone with Physicians for Human Rights and the United Nations Mission in Sierra Leone Human Rights Division, and served as a joint expert on gender crimes and post-traumatic stress disorder for the International Criminal Court. She provides forensic evaluations, human rights consultations, and mitigation services on capital cases for private legal firms and public entities. Through the years, her work has taught her about the impact of secondary traumatic stress, vicarious trauma, and compassion fatigue, highlighting the need for self-care. Drawing on her experiences and research in this area, Dr. Akinsulure-Smith has conducted workshops addressing the importance of self-care for mental service providers nationally and internationally. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Akinsulure-Smith to get us started.
So thank you so much, and congratulations, Dr. Amoh.
Thank you.
So I'd really like to start by thanking Biz, Justine, and Cecilia for doing me the honor of an invitation to participate in this conference. I'm really humbled to be on this panel and just a larger distinguished company. I don't have a slide point presentation. I decided I'm just going to talk. So much of my work in this area has focused on the experiences of forced migrants, refugees, asylees, asylum seekers, and undocumented individuals. Having said this, I bring you greetings from my colleagues and our clients at the Bellevue Program for Survivors of Torture, people who I've had the privilege of working with and for since 1999. And Andy, you almost blew my spot up because I was really worried that you were going to start talking about PSOT, because that's what I'm doing here today. So the Bellevue Program for Survivors of Torture is located within Bellevue, within the Bellevue Hospital Center. Many of you do not know this, but our hospital, Bellevue Hospital Center, was founded on March 31st, 1736. It's the nation's oldest public hospital. Our program has been around since the Bellevue Program for Survivors of Torture, since 1995. And we've provided direct service in the form of medical, mental health, social, and legal services to people from all around the world who come to New York City fleeing human rights abuses, armed conflict, and torture. We also engage in research, education, and advocacy. Since the program started, we have provided services to rebuild the lives of over 6,500 individuals from more than 112 countries, regardless of their ability to pay. So having given you this introduction to our program, for me, the charge to contribute to a panel about mental health realities and treatments in the fields for this population in particular is really a big one. Has already been highlighted in other panels from yesterday and then again from this morning. often as clinicians and researchers, when we think about trauma, we tend to go straight to PTSD. However, in my world, in my experience with this particular population, trauma extends beyond this. In fact, just focusing on PTSD is almost too simple. Um, the majority of the forced migrants who my colleagues and I work with at PSOT struggle with a myriad of traumas, and their mental health realities range from obvious physical traumas to their bodies, invisible emotional distress, depression, anxiety, PTSD, complicated grief, to extensive, innumerable losses. Having experienced extensive distress before leaving their countries, during their search for safety, once they arrive wherever they find themselves, this population finds themselves facing even more hurdles, learning a new language, a new culture, seemingly endless separation from family and loved ones, learning new laws, new social environments, new weather, our subways in New York City. In the face of all of these challenges and more, they labor to restart and rebuild their lives, often from zero. All of these factors influence their mental health realities. But beyond trauma, whatever traumas they may have suffered from pre-migration, during migration, there are many, again, additional post-migration factors that impact and influence their mental health realities. I know I don't need to remind you, but in the last 7 years here in the US and around the world, we have been inundated by a relentless flood of racist, anti-immigrant rhetoric. These xenophobic notions have repeatedly warned us that immigrants come to steal jobs and services, bring crime and violence, and disease to sully our beautiful shores. So these are also part of those mental health realities. The fear, the concept, the way they're seen. In today's world, mental health realities are further compounded by the additional harsh realities created by COVID-19. And this population is especially vulnerable. We're talking about food and housing insecurity, diminished income and resources, under and unappreciated work, lengthy waits while languishing in detention centers or in the community for immigration courts to reopen so that their asylum cases can be heard, all while fearing the knock on the door of ICE, US Immigration Customs and Customs Enforcement. At the Bellevue Program for Survivors of Torture, our approach to working with survivors includes seeing them as people who have resources and assets, which have enabled them to survive their victimization. We recognize the necessity of a culturally sensitive approach, which utilizes the client's own cultural and religious practices and resources. We focus on symptom reduction and helping survivors rebuild their lives by assisting with social adjustment and connecting clients to supports within that country and within the community. So I'm saying all this. What does this mean? Bottom line is our approach to treatment has been an integrative, holistic, trauma-informed one, in which we bring together physical, mental, and social services. Our work is drawn from the fields of psychology, psychiatry, and social work, and it's really guided by works of authors who and researchers who you're very, very familiar with: Judith Herman, Bessel van der Kolk, and others. My dear friend and colleague, Dr. Kate Porterfield, in a brilliant chapter entitled The Principles of Care of Survivors of Organized Violence in a Global Society," has laid out the principles that guide our work succinctly. The first one is around building safety and security first. If we're not able to build safety and security within our program for our clients, we're not able to facilitate the trust building that leads to the work that helps facilitate the healing. The second one is strength, resilience, and survival. What are the resources that the individual brings? What resources can we as a program, as a community, help them build on? Providing knowledge, psychoeducation, explaining to people what their response is, to these are, you've been through an abnormal situation, and your responses, you're not crazy. They go hand in hand. And this is how we work to help you. Rebuilding the community is the third one. Trauma has this way of destroying human connection. It can be isolating, it's stigma filled, and can be shameful. Within our program, we really use a lot of group work, helping the person understand that they're not alone, that there is a community. So we provide multiple opportunities for the survivor to connect to a larger community. The fourth one is around narrative as empowerment. We've talked a little bit about narrative exposure therapy, but here what I'm talking about is recognition of the individual's agency and power in choosing to tell their story. Not everyone wants to do so or is able to do so. We can talk, about what happens in asylum hearings where people are expected to tell their story, whether or not they are ready to, and how that can impact them. The fifth is cultural competency, which we started talking about in the previous panel. Recognizing and working within the cultural identity of the individual, the survivor that we're working with, becomes key. And the sixth one is meaning making, validating and acknowledging the individual's unique and subjective way of making meaning of what through what experiences are, because this is going to vary from individual to individual. According to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, there are over 8 million people displaced around the world. Of course, I'm highlighting this number because we all know this. In the last decade or so, the number has risen exponentially. What is more shocking for me, or in addition to everything else about these 8 million, is that 40% of the world's displaced are children under 18. And the crazy reality is that many displaced people go to neighboring countries that is as poor and as unstable as theirs was. Only a tiny percentage make it to a third country or to the West. So when we think about interventions, where are we doing the interventions? What developmental age are we aiming our interventions at? We have to put that into the consideration. For here in the US, during the past, during the years of the previous administration, the US has gone from leading the world in refugee resettlement for decades to what I've been told is a historic 80% drop. As other panelists pointed out yesterday, there are a range of interventions and levels of professionals providing services, not only within the US, but also outside to low and middle income countries that are going on around the world that we could stand to learn from. But I do think that having these conversations about what the mental health realities are, both here and there, and then we think about how to address them, we have to also remember, as much as the rhetoric is out there, that for the 80 million plus people who are separated from their families, forced to leave their homes and their communities, their countries, and who are experiencing devastating losses and extensive traumas in their search for safety, that as much as the rhetoric is out there, this is not a choice. Nobody chooses this to happen to them. So on that note, I want to thank you all again. I'm going to pause. I think I've already gone over my time. I look forward to a very rich discussion to follow.
Thank you, Dr. Akinsulure-Smith, for that enriching discussion. Next, we have Dr. Mohammed Al-Shasli. Dr. Mohammed Al-Shasli is a consultant psychiatrist from Egypt with more than 15 years of experience in clinical mental health services and humanitarian mental health and psychosocial support services during and after humanitarian emergencies. Dr. Mohammed has worked with governments, non-governmental organizations, and United Nations agencies in Egypt, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Bangladesh, and Nigeria. In his work, Dr. Elshazly focuses on mainstreaming of mental health interventions within the humanitarian response architecture, strengthening of community-based mental health initiatives, and scaling up brief psychological interventions. Dr. Elshazly is the co-founder of More Associated Consultants, a group of committed experts in mental health and psychosocial support and social cohesion. So I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Elshazly.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity and thank you for the great presentation. I really enjoyed watching it. Share my screen if this may help a bit. I have a very brief PowerPoint presentation. I have no intention to recording PowerPoint, so it's just like a few slides. I'll try to look at the time as well. Okay, that's it. So, basically, I would like first to put the landscape for the mental health in humanitarian emergencies. And I guess this question we get usually asked about how many people, what's the percentage of affected communities who may need some sort of or some level of mental health services. The reality says that most of the research found that up to 20% of affected populations may have some sort of mental health problems, ranging from mild to severe problems. So it's 22, but let's say 20 for the ease of the math. And these 20% of people, they may have these mental health problems or troubles because of pre-existing problems that existed before the emergency or displacement, or related to some factors induced by the emergency itself and the consequences of it, like gender-based violence, displacement, lack of access to care, and stuff like this. Or sometimes they are induced by the protracted humanitarian situation, which we could see like almost everywhere now. Most of the humanitarian emergencies at the moment, they start, but they never end. They continue for years and years. The point here is that most of these mental health problems are mild and moderate problems. They are not severe problems. Only 5% out of this 22 are severe problems. Why I'm saying this? Because this percentage or this fact has its own impact on how we design and plan services and to what extent we need specialized mental health professionals to deliver mental health service in this context. See, over the last 20 years, there is a very clear change in the paradigm of service provision, changing from the very biological, facility-based approaches to mental health to more of psychosocial and community-based models. So rather than thinking about people that they have very pathological reactions and they need to be treated by psychiatrists, by psychotropic medications, or even by psychologists, we start to change this. We start to change the look and look more into the community resources, that resources that exist within affected communities, within their individuals, within the culture, within the customs, and to see how we can factor these existing resources into our mental health service and make good use of them. Why we are saying that this paradigm shift, we think it's important. Well, it's not something new. It's over the last 20 or 25 years because we see that there is limited human resources in terms of mental health service. So you cannot rely only on mental health professionals for mental health service. You need to think creatively how to share or share this task with others, but also relying more on community-based resources will help your interventions to be more culturally sensitive and, of course, will be more acceptable by population and will improve access to these services. I put a very famous photo here. I know this pyramid is almost known by everyone who works in the humanitarian field. And of course, as an Egyptian, I like pyramids, so you'll find I put pyramids wherever I can. I'm choosing the levels of interventions for mental health. So quickly, when we design mental health programs to address this 20% or 5%, we need always to keep this multi-layered approach. Multi-layered, we say that almost 100% of the population, they need social consideration basic service provision, which means we need to think how to be culturally sensitive and consider social factors when we offer food for people, when we provide them with health services or with shelter. And level is how we work more on community and family support. And in that sense, we think how to restore the social fabric that used to exist before the emergency and used to have a very protective value for these communities. So we should focus our programs on this. We restore this social network and social functioning, which is very helpful for people. Then a third layer, which focuses on how we provide services focusing on mental health, but provided by specialized people. So I can train teachers at the time of COVID-19 on how to provide support for the kids. I can train nurses in primary health care how to offer psychological first aid or psychoeducation for people with depression. Then the top layer, which is the specialized mental health service delivered by specialized or by mental health professionals, and it is expected to serve up to 5%. An important development in psychological intervention in emergencies is the scalable psychological intervention, which we consider it as the new wave or a new fashion of delivering psychological interventions in emergencies. They are group interventions. They are transdiagnostic, which means they can apply to a wide range of psychological and emotional problems. They can be delivered by non-specialized people, so you can train lay people, you can train school counselors, you can train teachers, you can train nurses in primary health care, you can train them in delivering these interventions. But of course, provided that you have very clear scheme for training and supervision of these stuff to avoid doing any further harm. And they are being now piloted everywhere. They are endorsed by donors, WHO and other UN agencies. They are doing great work on this direction. A second point in relation to trauma and how we conceptualize the word trauma in the humanitarian or the field or the emergencies. We try as much as we can to minimize the use of the word trauma outside the clinical settings in the humanitarian field. So we try when we discuss with the community as much as we can to try to avoid using it, because sometimes it has its own cultural repercussions as well. Sometimes the word trauma perceived by some cultures or communities as a sign of weakness, and of course it's very non-specific. What's traumatizing to me maybe not traumatizing to someone else. But the point here is we cannot ignore the impact of the past trauma on the mental well-being of affected individuals. It's impossible to ignore this. Trauma exists there. However, research found that the daily stressors of the daily life of a refugee or an immigrant, this daily stressors, they mediate the impact of these traumatic events on the mental well-being. So we cannot or we should not be over-trapped in the past and ignore the present challenges that a refugee would feel. Like Dr. Adeyinka was just saying, like someone how to navigate through an underground, how to find a school for his kid, how to secure health care. These daily life challenges, they are very, very risky to mental well-being. So sometimes programs tend to focus too much on the past trauma, but they don't look how to provide more of social support just for here and now. So we should be very careful of this. Over the past 10 years, there is a growing collaboration between the field experts and the researchers to develop agendas for research priorities. So we can see clearly now that there is a very good and positive progress in the research agenda to be informed by the field leads. And there is one of that, of course, just one example, the John Hopkins research project about the research priorities, and it's led by Dr. Paul, and I think they are now publishing the result of this project. I think I need to finish in a few seconds, right? I'm taking over time. So quickly, how to improve access to mental health care during and after emergencies. We have hundreds of activities and ways to answer these questions. We just pulled just the four that came to the surface of my mind. I thought them they are relevant to my experience as well. The first one, we need to make sure that mental health services are integrated with existing sector responses. So we need to integrate mental health within the primary care, with the protection, with the education. Standing alone mental health services are less accessible and very stigmatized. We should always keep mental health integrated. Number two, we need to improve the cultural competencies of our mental health services. This is very, very important. Most of the developments in the field of healthcare in general, and mental health specifically, are developed in Western countries. I cannot just easily just explore this and bring it to the field without doing more of our homework of culture sensitization or checking the cultural competencies. Of course, this cultural competency will improve the accent utilization, but otherwise, you can see very fancy programs, but they are underutilized by populations because they are not culturally sensitive. Number three, engage communities in decisions. Communities should be empowered, engaged in the design, implementation, and evaluation of mental health programs. They are strong enough. We should not talk about them. We should talk with them. And number four, the last, is how to strengthen more of innovative approaches like the telemental health. So we also provide mental health service to remote areas. The last thing is culture plays a very important role in how individuals make sense and react to stressful moments. It's very important. And culturally relevant and local healing mechanisms should be always investigated for potential integration of mental health activities. Look at their own indigenous healing mechanisms. Don't ignore them and just bring your bag full of medications and sheets. No, look at what we have already there. It's always very helpful for them. And traditional healers, religious leaders, and community leaders should be always included in our programs as much as we can, provided that they are not doing harm and they are accepted by their communities. Sorry for taking time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Elshazly. Finally, we'll hear from our last panelist, Mr. Niconchuk. Michael Niconchuk is an applied neuroscience researcher and practitioner focusing on mental health of conflict-affected populations and the relationship between trauma and intergroup violence. Mr. Niconchuk is the program director for trauma and violent conflict at Beyond Conflict, as well as the senior technical expert for mental health and psychosocial support at QuestScope in Amman, Jordan. Based in Jordan, he oversees the design and implementation of research and applied projects that address the role of chronic stress and trauma in the genesis and escalation of violent conflict, and the role of trauma healing in conflict resolution efforts. He is the author of several innovative scientific publications on issues of neuroscience, violent extremism, and intergroup conflict. He is also the author of the Field Guide for Barefoot Psychology, a psychoeducational and trauma recovery program for communities affected by trauma and forced displacement. Mr. Niconchuk is a former Fulbright scholar and holds degrees from Tufts University and University College, London. I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Niconchuk.
Thank you so much. I'm going to time myself and start sharing some slides, if that's okay with everybody. So I promise not to go too far over time. So Biz, others, keep me in line, right? Send me a slap across the virtual space here. So I'm going to share my screen real quickly. I think I'm doing this right. All right, you should be, can someone give me an amen of some kind if you can see my slides? All right, wonderful. We're talking in this panel about grounding things in reality a bit more, right? And grounding things in the realities that we experience in the field. So having just come from a Zaatari refugee camp today, I got a big slap in the face of reality. So I'm bringing a little bit of that to the presentation today. I want to start with giving respect to the fact that there's so much cultural legacy in this part of the world that I'm sitting in the Middle East, as well as every culture around the world, in trying to understand and codify and quantify and understand human experiences to trauma and to traumatic events. Because throughout history, humans have had adverse reactions and all sorts of adaptations in brain, body, and behavior in response to trauma. We see in the 1920s, those who were put in Craig Lockhart institutions and treated for shell shock with all sorts of funky treatments. They wrote poems like Wilfred Owen's Mental Cases, where he said, "These are men whose minds the dead have ravished, memory fingers in their hair of murders, multitudinous murders they once witnessed. Waiting sloughs of flesh, these helpless wander, treading blood from lungs that had loved laughter." So we see even in poetry, early conceptualizations of what it feels like to go through tremendous pain and trauma. And just today, as I was being deposed for someone's asylum case, he said this to me. He said, "Is my suffering enough? Should I lie? Should I talk more about my nightmares? Why do I feel like I'm guilty of something? This wasn't my fault. Is it not enough that I feel like I want to die every day?" And that lived experience of trauma, I can tell you that for this young man, the quantification or classification of his pathology, he does not give a shit about that. He cares about this feeling every day when he wakes up of wanting to die because of what he's experiencing. So yes, we have many manuals, especially the ICD-10 and DSM, ways of recognizing symptom clusters that we've defined around certain pathologies. And these were first codified in this way after the experiences of World War II veterans. But there's all sorts of issues here. And we've talked throughout this conference about deprioritizing pathology. And that's what helped grounds us in reality, because the reality of folks is that they're living tremendous distress. And distress reduction and improved functioning is really the name of the game for trauma-affected populations around the world. There's a certain value to pathology, especially in an industrialized mental health context like the United States. No diagnosis, no insurance coverage. So we don't want to be exporting that type of model without recognizing its flaws that exist in the current way that we prioritize pathology. Who does that serve and why? How do we expand to appreciate culturally specific expressions of symptoms and also subclinical forms of distress? Because as of now, the pathology is actually what dictates aid decisions. Instead of looking at it as a pathology approach, we should look at it as adaptation, not illness. So by looking at it as adaptation, we're accommodating folks with diverse symptom profiles and subclinical forms of distress that still matter. Neuroscientifically, we're talking about trauma causing adaptations at 4 different major levels: the brain, the body, self-concept, and behavior. That includes biological changes that promote threat vigilance and threat reactivity, psychological and cognitive changes that promote the sense of insecurity in my own body, in my community, in places that were once easy for me to be in, even in my own skin. And then behavioral changes that include avoidance and intensification of in-group identification with groups that protect me, lack of trust in family members, friends, potentially in-group members, but specifically out-group or vilified members of other communities, and then changes in theory of mind networks in the brain and empathy. And these things, of course, many of these things seem like necessary and normal adaptations to injustices. So who benefits from the pathologizing of normal responses to injustice? And how does that affect how we provide services in the field? So we have to look here to the models that express what happens in untreated trauma as a bioecological model, looking at Bronfenbrenner's early models of ecological systems theory. Unaddressed trauma over time starts with adaptations in our individual cells and neurobiology that, if left untreated, whether or not it reaches certain symptom clusters, no matter how it's clustered or manifested, it leads to adaptations in the self, in the body, in psychology, in behavior, then which trickles into relationships, communities, systems, and culture. And untreated trauma across those different levels contributes to the maintenance of traumatic experiences for those very same individuals and for subsequent generations in that community. So in this way, we can see trauma adaptations affecting individual relationships, interpersonal relationships, all the way up to intergroup relationships and the way that individuals and groups relate to systems. This is clear in the data. We know that trauma is more than an individual issue. This is a political issue. This is a social issue. Data from various fields has shown that chronic adversity and trauma have been linked to criminal behavior, violent activism, shout out to Heidi Ellis, recidivism back into crime, reconciliation attitudes. Some say that increased reconciliation, some pro, some against, etc. Addictive behaviors, violent extremism, especially early childhood trauma and trauma with fathers. Has been, look at Pete Simi's research showing that white extremists have a tremendously elevated percentage of early childhood trauma, intergroup hostility, appetitive aggression, and sexual and gender-based violence. And then, of course, there's the economic side of productivity losses. So all these youth empowerment programs around the world, without incorporating trauma, are understanding that they're putting into workforce folks that are still not fully functioning in the way that they would like them to be. This is what has led the WHO partially to revisit their model, similar to what Dr. Elshazly said about the IASC pyramid model. The WHO has a model that they've promoted where we should focus on bottom of the pyramid services. Services that are looking at the right-hand arrow, low cost, and on the left-hand arrow have a high frequency of need, because the folks that are in that high level of truly needing professional intervention and mental health care is actually much smaller than the folks who need some sort of care that addresses these trauma adaptations that have trickle effects across society. So there's greater quantity of services needed of things that are informal. Informal not meaning disorganized, informal meaning that they take place outside of formal and professional healthcare settings. So informal community care and self-care models are what the WHO has been trying to promote since 2003. Now there's a money where your mouth is problem here, because still from 2005 to 2020, less than 0.5 of international health aid has gone to mental health, and that has remained stagnant over the past 20 years, even though mental health statistics have gotten dramatically worse across all these places. Professionalized care is never going to be scalable. Sitting here in Jordan, I'm looking at the statistics of mental health professionals per 100,000 population. The US, which still has a lack of especially qualified brown and black therapists, has 10 psychiatrists per 100K, 30 psychologists. Jordan has less than 10% of that for psychiatrists. And then we go to Syria, which has a country which has more than 50% of its children exhibiting signs and symptoms of PTSD, and then Yemen. So the more in need a country is in its humanitarian state, the less they are having access to professional care, which is obviously why folks have tried to innovate in different contexts to promote scalable trauma solutions. But those solutions exist on a range of how scalable they might be. And what makes something scalable or not? There's a couple of factors looking at the bottom here. The specialization, do I need 150 hours of training and 12 degrees from fancy institutions to do it? Is it safe to do by an untrained or semi-trained or non-professional, paraprofessional? Is it culturally sensitive? Is it relevant? Is it in the native language? Is it cost effective? Does it actually change anything? Is it the right intervention? So things like psychopharmacology, which have to be administered by psychiatrists, are obviously not very scalable insofar as they depend on medicine availability and the availability of certified clinicians. Then we have things like EMDR, CBT, which still require a high degree of professionalization and have sort of mixed outcomes in developing contexts, down to other approaches that have been more recently advocated by the WHO, like PM+, Problem Management Plus, things like trauma-informed community empowerment, and our field guide for barefoot psychology. One way to think or how to capture these interventions and understand them is to think about them in these 4 different quadrants. Elements to consider when looking at scalable trauma interventions in developing contexts where symptom distress and symptom burden is the primary goal. How safe is it? How easy is it to deliver? How cost effective is it? And what are the long-term improvements in clinical or relevant gains for the individual going through the program? And I'll conclude just by saying that we need to measure better. Because while we have innovated, there's still tremendous gaps in data on how we think about this. Existing data is from Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic countries to a large extent. There's an overrepresentation of folks that have gone through these types of programs in detention and incarceration facilities, a massive underrepresentation of men. Of all of the RCTs that have been done, for example, on PM+, almost all of them have included only symptomatic sort of women who meet the clinical threshold of PTSD, whereas men are the primary perpetrators of trauma in these contexts. So we have a massive problem of having appropriate services for men in community contexts. The data have been focused on diagnosed populations, so still maintaining the hegemony of pathology. And then most of the interventions tested still require trained psychotherapists, though not all. And I'll conclude by saying that even these indicators, as was said in the last panel, what does a change? So we know that trauma is linked to all these antisocial community outcomes, that it's linked to community instability, but we don't have almost any causal data to show that if you touch mental health, how do you then downstream affect those changes in peace building outcomes and increases in pro-sociality and social stability in conflict affected communities? So that should be something that's really high up on the research agenda, and I'll conclude there.
Thank you, Mr. Niconchuk, and thank you to our panelists for the wonderful presentations. So in listening to your presentations, I was particularly struck by the conversation around centering our understanding of what it takes to do trauma work from a culturally grounded stance. We heard about individuals having to learn new laws, new cultural norms, new ways of living, and practitioners really sort of focusing on community-based models and restoring social functioning and deprioritizing pathology. I think in the US, we often view ourselves as experts and authorities in psychological knowledge and skills, and resultantly have a tendency to overlook the ways that trauma is defined across cultures, and in turn, how recovery and resilience may also be differentially defined. So with that being said, I'm wondering if each of you can speak to how we broaden knowledge about trauma and facilitate connection and collaboration with communities impacted by trauma, and how we facilitate connection with other scientists without disrupting cultural understandings of trauma and resilience.
I'm gonna kind of jump in and just speak to the work that I have been involved in with Teresa Betancourt in Sierra Leone, looking at youth. And, you know, one of the things that I've loved about that project and being part of it is the thoughtful way we have approached it, because it's not been what we saw post conflict with people just helicoptering in from everywhere and doing this. You know, this person would walk in and do this kind of intervention, do that kind of intervention. Rather, it was built up from research that she had done over several years. It was about reaching out to the community. It was about educating. It was about finding out what is there, very often when some clinicians, some researchers go in, they act as if these people were just there to be found, as if we, and I'm saying this from from the Sierra Leonean perspective, from doing that work, as if we have no capacity, we have no agency, we didn't have anything there that we used for healing before. So it was very much going into the communities, talking with people, talking with the elders. And then the building was around, you know, what is the language? How can we incorporate the culture into the intervention? Using group work, using language, connecting not just with the local communities, but also across the spectrum. You know, not just waiting for, thinking about, for example, in Sierra Leone, we had for a long time, we only had one psychiatrist, and talk about low resource setting with, quote, no mental health, but then partnering with you know, people who had basic education to train them to conduct the intervention, the youth readiness intervention that we have been using there, that's been quite successful. So I think there are many ways that we can thoughtfully engage local communities, countries, to do good work.
I would, if I may, you know, in this part of the world, we have a really biology forward approach to how we do work in the Middle East, because biology and the physiology of trauma actually is not how the DSM is organized, but it's how the human body is organized. It's looking at multiple different ways that a person can be affected by this by simply talking a little bit about cortisol, about norepinephrine, and things that go on in the brain and body as a result of trauma. Those are universal experiences, because while culture matters so deeply, biology doesn't necessarily erase any cultural understandings of trauma. Working in the Middle East, you know, there's a rich legacy of folks like Elshazly, Abu Zaid al-Balkhi, and al-Razi that were doing early fantastic work that rivals what you see in the DSM as far as clinical descriptions of different disorders, whether it be anxiety or PTSD. But at the same time, so much of what Western psychotherapy and trauma treatment is based on, a foundational sort of Cartesian split between mind and body, doesn't exist in Islam. You're talking about a quadrant model where you're looking at ruh, qalb, aql, and nafs, so self, heart, soul, and mind. And so the way that we understand Western psychotherapy simply breaks down, which is why we've been sort of really been excited about using a biology forward approach, because it has a transcultural validity that doesn't delegitimize existing cultural practices. What we should see more of is investing research money in validating cultural practices like Islamic prayer. Convince me that Islamic prayer is less good than downward dog. But how much are we funding sheikhs and imams versus nice, well-meaning people to come in and do yoga for refugees? Why? That's because we haven't produced the data to validate cultural practices.
Dr. Al-Shasli, would you like to respond?
Well, I have nothing much to add to what my colleagues would mention. I echo them, but I just to stress on the cultural idioms of trauma itself. So how local cultures, they have their own definition of trauma. Is a very important factor that affects how people experience, but also how they express the impact of these traumatic events. So I would always think of how to integrate and how to study this first, then how to integrate it with our practice to support the mental health of these affected communities. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Elshazly, and thank you all for your responses. At this time, we'll open up the floor to the audience for questions. I think we have our first question I can read. It says, have you found that donors, funders are hesitant to support high need and low cost methods of mental health support, such as self-care and informal community care, or has there been a push within the field to support this approach?
There has been a push and there is hesitance, right? So this is a both and situation, where there is, the WHO since 2003 has been promoting this informal community care, yet research funding has not fallen in line accordingly. So they want, the WHO and UNHCR and the IASC want community care in informal models, yet they want them to be evidence-based. Yet those who are funding the production of evidence there's a lag with them funding necessary evidence that meets thresholds of academic publication to promote those methods. So there's a time lag. I think the industry is moving in that direction, but the hesitance is very real. And at the same time, there's also a necessary simultaneous effort by folks like Vikram Patel to look at what does it mean to have this massive paraprofessional workforce that in their native countries are being trained to do these types of models, but have no pathways to professionalization, because a lot of developing countries are replicating the worst aspects of professionalized mental health care and not the good bits. So supervision models that also reinforce and reify do no harm principles is critical at the same time as we see the industry changing with funding.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Niconchuk. Dr. Rasmussen says, excellent presentations all. A question that keeps coming up for me: do we shoot ourselves in the foot by focusing so much on trauma? It sounds like lots of bad things that happen don't fit into clinical models of trauma, but that do fit into current stressors in general. And then there's the issue of mental health as an avenue to address what are also social and political issues. I think there is probably some role there, but I worry that mental health practitioners often see every solution as therapeutic when there are probably better social and political strategies that can address the problems of displaced persons. Maybe. So I think the core question there is, do we shoot ourselves in the foot by focusing so much on trauma? And are there other ways to perhaps conceptualize some of these issues?
I have some thoughts, but I'd like to defer to other panelists to answer first.
Well, okay, so Mr. Ben, I may have a take on here. I guess, well, if I look at, well, I'm looking at one angle of the subject, which is the emergencies or the humanitarian context. I think there has been a change, as I mentioned in my presentation, the paradigm, by not focusing, but rather focusing on trauma, to moving to more wider community-based psychosocial support services, and how now we conceptualize mental health and psychological and social factors as even as one term, MHPSS. In reality, I would say yes, focusing too much on the trauma rather than resilience, focusing on the risk rather than protection, focusing on the illness rather than recovery is something, of course, that's not helpful, especially in design programs. But it's not just like, I don't want to see it as if I am encouraging ignoring the trauma or people who are affected by severe adversity. I think that the clear point that I want to make that it's people are not affected in the same way. They respond differently based on many factors. Our programs should be inclusive and should be directed more towards recovery and resilience rather than just being dragged in the trauma and being stagnant there. But every person, whatever the level of concern or suffering, should be very, very respected and considered in our program. Thank you. That's my take on it.
Yeah, I think to follow up on that, with our program at PSOT, the focus is really on where the client is at that point in time. Is it about, the stressors of adjusting to life in New York City? Is it about housing? Is it about the fact that there are 6 of us sleeping in one room? Is it about the stressors of what I am hearing from family back home? Now, when the push for trauma focus comes in my experience, is when we're dealing with asylum seekers, and the expectation is that they have to go present their case in the asylum hearing. And so often what I feel happens is that the treatment gets hijacked to prepare them, as they're understandably very anxious and distressed about having to go in front of an immigration judge or an asylum officer, and are forced to share some of the worst things that have ever happened to them. And so then the work becomes around helping them address and cope with that. But our policy has not been to force the trauma conversation until the individual is ready.
Look, I mean, to Dr. Rasmussen's question, I think we shoot ourselves in the foot by focusing on clinical models of trauma, not by focusing on trauma. I mean, so much about a conflict survivor's life is traumatic and stressful. I mean, gosh, I can hardly tell a refugee in Zatari today, oh, you're in a post-trauma phase. You're not. Your life is crap, objectively. It's a horrible situation. There's no prospects for it getting better in the immediate future. It's incredibly difficult. Even the changes that people have undergone in their brains, bodies, and behaviors aren't even necessarily maladaptive in that context because they're survival oriented. They are towards survival. So they're not even necessarily maladaptive. The very notion of PTSD was about correcting maladaptations that are no longer suited to the safe context that a person is in. But so many folks in conflict affected communities are still in unsafe environments where these adaptations continue being advantageous to heighten the risk of survival for them. If you look at it from an allostatic model, looking at what happens in the body, whether it's stress or trauma, these are about a spectrum of events, of adversities that alter your neurophysiology and brain chemistry in a way that changes human behavior and interaction and intergroup relations in the long term in that bioecological model. At the same time, in some cases, it's obvious. Looking at Heidi Ellis's research, one of the main factors contributing to the development of PTSD of Somali migrants in the Boston area was the experience of discrimination. Well, okay, then let's stop discrimination. Then you become a researcher activist, a scientist activist, which is a really risky role, as we know from how tenure works. Look at the past month, right? So that role is really, really complicated for anybody. But at the same time, we can't fool ourselves into thinking that the provision of justice is better than healing in some way. Healed people pursue merciful justice. And people that have achieved justice are often more willing to go through healing processes. But data from truth commissions around the world has shown us that simply by creating spaces for justice, we're not doing the healing process any favors. In many cases, looking at South Africa and Guatemala, we see that folks that have gone through TRC processes actually have worse mental health outcomes because there was a focus on justice and not on trauma sensitivity with justice hand in hand. So that pursuit has to be something joint, because it's really difficult for me, to someone who feels that they've been a victim of a conflict, to say, now you have a burden. Not only do you suffer in whatever country of origin you're from, you now have a burden of dealing with all of these adaptations that are unwanted. You don't like hitting your wife and your daughter. Okay, that's on you to change. People are tired of having the burden of change be on them because the political suffering was already enough. But to get people to that space, it's about accompanying folks to that space where knowing that healing itself is a very act of resistance. And how do we normalize that throughout societies?
Thank you. And I want to recognize Nicole and Angie for adding their reflections and thoughts about this conversation. I think we have one last question. What are your thoughts on how to overcome ingrained mistrust of medical providers or stigma of psychological problems / care that might exist within a community and create a barrier to collaboration?
Well, I just mentioned one line. Of course, there are many lines and strategies here, but I think the one that I find most important is community engagement. You need to engage communities in the design of mental health service. You need to go to the community with a blank paper, not with a predetermined set of actions. Go with people, sit with them, see how they see mental health from their perspective, how they expect mental health services, what are their needs, how they want to shape these sources, and then continue the dialogue. Go with a blank paper. This would be my first recommendation. Thank you.
In our program, it's about being present, being available, being accessible. In fact, many of our clients come to us from the community through word of mouth. So, that community connection and reputation has stood and helped us with that.
I mean, folks have been, we haven't set up systems in very kind ways that make it easy to overcome that mistrust. And it's not simply a mistrust of providers. It's in a place like a refugee camp, it's mistrust of the auntie down the street who's going to see you walking into the psych ward. And then auntie's going to tell the other auntie, and then it's going to spread like wildfire. And then you're going to be the crazy one. And so it's not simply about the interactions between providers, it's also about undoing generations-long stigmas because of how we've misunderstood and caused certain misunderstandings around mental health. And the truth is, it takes a lot of work to sit with someone in a space long enough where they feel that and they can truly accept that what they're experiencing is often it's not a justification. An explanation is not a justification. Those are different things. And having explanations for how we have adapted the way we have to very abnormal circumstances, how we're having normal responses to circumstances and experiences that were abnormal. That takes grace, accompaniment, and humility on the side of both. And that requires, as everybody has said, real deep relationships with community.
Thank you. I think a final question that I have that's twofold for all of the panelists is, where do you see the field moving in 5 years? And do you have any recommendations for next steps for researchers and practitioners?
I'm super concerned about the direction of the field. I think that trauma has become way too much of a buzzword, as has PTSD. I think people throw it around too loosely, where actually the critical and important people that do have that need professionalized care are going to be not going to be taken seriously. Because the reality is that a refugee that has experienced sexualized torture is different than someone who's experiencing mild to moderate distress. Those are different cases, and that matters. And the more that we actually, it's the same thing we do to a lot of words. We make them lose their legitimacy by popularizing them in the West, and where they lose their value for brown and black folks who actually need those classifications in certain moments and contexts. So I'm actually more concerned about the quality of research and where the industry is going, because of how it's going to promote a trickle-down effect of non-evidence-based bad programs for folks that can't afford the good programs that are commodified in the forms of apps and professionalized psychotherapy. I'll say something optimistic. I do think that the science is advancing dramatically, the neurobiology, and understanding how these adaptations truly do have long-term effects and social stability.
I mean, I think what I would add to what you just said is looking to see what happens, at least from where I'm sitting in terms of our program and service provision, what goes on in the political environment, because that has a lot to do with funding. And you know, we're kind of being optimistic and hopeful now with the change, and we'll see where that takes us in terms of resources and funding.
Yeah. What we would finally add is, I guess what looks promising is the development of more psychological interventions that can be delivered by non-specialized people. The scalable psychological intervention is a promising move in terms of HBSS services in the field, and I guess huge steps have been taken so far, and there are still a lot in the pipeline. Thank you.
Thank you. We are at time. Thank you again to our panelists for sharing their work, insight, and perspectives. And thank you, everyone, for attending and for engaging in this very important conversation. We will be creating a breakout room for anyone who would like to engage in further discussion about topics raised during this session. So please stick around if you're interested in continuing the conversation. We hope that you found this session informative and stimulating, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference. Have a great day and be safe and well. Thank you, everyone.